Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On such a beautiful night, I'm sure you have many things to do as this turn of weather has become so positive, but we're very happy that you're here. I wanted to begin the evening by welcoming you all because this is the first in a series of debates that our organization, This World of Values Network, plans to conduct on campuses throughout the country on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the opportunities for peace. Having served as rabbi to the students of Oxford University for 11 years, Oxford has a great debate tradition. I've always respected rules-based debates. And as I've watched more and more of the conflict spill over into campus life and calls for boycott, sanctions, etc., and two sides that are warring, I really thought that there should be more dialogue and there should be more debate. There should be more rules-based debates where the two sides can actually come together, not necessarily always in harmony and dialogue, but even to present their case before the public. That would best serve the interests of free speech and best serve the interests of both sides. We're very proud and honored to have such a distinguished panel this evening to conduct our first debate. Let me quickly welcome some of the speakers, though they will be properly introduced, but many of them are friends. Peter Beinart and I have known each other for about 22, 23 years, ever since he was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, and I was the Chabad rabbi and then the head of the L'chaim Society. We spent a lot of Friday nights together. Thank you very much for joining us, Peter. Hussein, Ibish, and I know each other from a debate at Harvard Business School. I was with Alan Dershowitz. Who was on your side that night? I'm trying to remember.
I think it was Hassan Abdurrahman. He was PLO ambassador.
That's right. Did we win that night? I can't remember.
No one took the vote.
We'll assume that we did.
I don't think so. I think it was one of those matches where we both knocked ourselves out, frankly.
Well, Hussein, thank you very much for joining us again.
Thank you.
Bret Stephens is one of my dear friends and recently won the Pulitzer Prize for Distinguished Commentary. You read him every Tuesday in the Wall Street Journal. Thank you for being here. Bret, I always draft Bret into our events. And of course, I'm meeting for the first time Professor Stephanie Newman, who is Professor of War and Peace Studies here and Director of the Comparative Defense Studies program here at Columbia. I hope that's a very long title, many other accolades, but you'll have a proper introduction. And thank you very much for agreeing to be our moderator. Most of all, I want to thank Zanera Mubashir, who I'm about to introduce, who I just met. She's a student. You're born in Pakistan, or your family's from Pakistan? Born and raised in Pakistan. And you were instrumental in helping to organize this evening, as well as Jody, who's here, and Jason, and many of the people who work with us from the Beinart Institute of Jewish Studies in Jerusalem, where one of my children is currently studying, which was founded by Rabbi Shlomo Gestetner. They were very central to the organization of tonight's event. I'm very grateful, and everyone who comes from our organization, This World of Values Network. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I will return to my role as a panelist. Thank you very much. And if you want to know about the other debates, please make sure you sign up on our mailing list. God bless you. Thank you.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to Columbia University tonight. My name is Zanera Mubashir, and I'm the Vice President of Columbia International Relations Council Association. The cornerstone of the Circa Academics program is a year-long speaker series. Throughout the year, we attempt to host speakers who will contribute to our understanding of international affairs. Tonight, we are hosting a distinguished panel to discuss Israel's policies, especially as they pertain to security concerns in the Middle East. Please join us in welcoming our panelists tonight. Mr. Hussein Ibish. Hussein is a senior fellow at the American Task Force in Palestine. He has a PhD in comparative literature from the University of Massachusetts Amherst and is active in advocacy for the Arab causes in the United States. He is a weekly columnist for Now Lebanon. Ibish has won 3 awards. In 2002, he received the Arab American of the Year award from the Arab American Community Center for Economic and Social Services in Ohio. A year later, he was named the best spokesperson for the Arab cause by the New York Press. And in 2004, Ibish received the Dedicated Service Award from the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee. Thank you so much, Hussein, for joining us tonight. Mr. Bret Stephens is an American journalist who won the Pulitzer Prize in 2013. He worked for the Wall Street Journal as a foreign affairs columnist and a deputy editorial page editor, responsible for the editorial pages of the journal's European and Asian editions. He was editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post from 2002 to 2004. He won the 2008 Eric Brindle Award for Excellence in Opinion Journalism and the 2010 Best Prize. In 2005, Stephens was named the Young Global Leader by the World Economic Forum. He's also a frequent contributor to the Commentary magazine. Rabbi Shmuley Boteach is a founder of This World, the Values Network, an international organization dedicated to advancing universal Jewish values in the media and culture, and to affirming the Jewish people as a light unto the nations. Hailed as one of the most gifted public speakers, he won the London Times Preacher of the Year award and the Millennium, setting a record for points in the competition. Speaks regularly in the United States, Europe, Israel, Australia, South Africa, and Asia. He served as the host of the award-winning show Shalom in the Home and TLC, and the Shmuley Show on the Oprah and Friends Radio Network and the 770 WABC in NYC, and is the most listened radio show in America. Peter Beinart he's the author of The Crisis of Zionism and the editor of the Daily Beast blog, Open Zion, which fosters an open and unafraid conversation about Israel, Palestine, and Jewish future. He's also an associate professor of journalism of political science at the University of New York, senior political writer for the Daily Beast Newsweek, and a Schwartz Senior Fellow at the New America Foundation. Professor Stephanie Newman, who will be a moderator tonight, is a professor at the School of International Public Affairs at Columbia and a director of defense studies. Professor Newman's teaching interests are international relations, comparative foreign policy, third world security issues, and international arms trade and defense production. She previously served as director of the Comparative Defense Studies program as a visiting professor at the U.S. Military Academy, visiting professor at the New School for Social Research, and senior Fulbright Research Scholar in Sweden. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and I think we'll let Professor Newman take it from here.
Well, I think it's my turn, right?
Yes.
My job is to keep the peace tonight. That's my job, and to inform you of what the format will be, so there'll be no surprises. Basically, what we're going to do is we're going to have each speaker speak for approximately 10 minutes, from 8 to 10 minutes, and then I'm going to stop them. Then there's going to be, after each speaker speaks for about 8 to 10 minutes, there'll be a 5-minute rebuttal from each of the speakers. And finally, there will be 2 minutes given to each speaker for his closing remarks. The speaking order will be as follows. Professor Beinart will begin and will be followed by Mr. Stevens, and then Dr. Ibish, and finally Rabbi Boteach. I'm hoping that everybody will enjoy the evening and will keep their questions calm and very, very polite. All right, first, I think you're first, Peter.
Okay.
Thank you to Rabbi Shmuley for organizing this, to Professor Newman for moderating it, to Bret and Hussein. Our debate topic is, are Israel's policies justified in light of the security issues it faces? Well, it depends which policies you're talking about. Some of Israel's policies are not only justified, they fill me with pride. I'm thrilled that with American help, Israel has developed the Arrow and Iron Dome missile defense systems to protect against rocket fire. I'm thrilled that in a part of the world dominated by dictatorships, Israel, inside its original boundaries, has a raucous free press, free elections, and an independent judiciary. I'm thrilled that Israel treats victims of Syria's gruesome civil war and sends aid to earthquake victims in Haiti. It's in part because of my pride in these things that I proudly call myself a Zionist, and I believe in Israel's right to self-defense. But there is one very important Israeli policy that is not justified by the security threats that Israel faces: Israel's policy of paying its citizens to move into settlements in the West Bank. You can't justify that policy by citing Israel's security threats, because Israeli settlement policy increases Israel's security threats. Let me say that again. Paying Israelis to move into the West Bank seriously harms Israeli security. I suspect Bret and Shmuley will talk a lot tonight about the external dangers Israel faces, which is fine. But every time they do, remember this: the more frightening you think Israel's security challenges are, the more opposed you should be to Israeli settlement policies. That's our core argument tonight. First, let's be clear about the facts. Israel, inside its original boundaries, the so-called Green Line, established after its War of Independence, is a democracy. Although they suffer discrimination, Palestinian citizens of Israel, often called Arab Israelis, vote alongside their Jewish neighbors, live under the same legal system, and hold the same passports. In the West Bank, by contrast, which Israel conquered in 1967, Israel is not a democracy. Today, everyone in the West Bank lives under the ultimate control of the State of Israel. Israel controls 60% of the West Bank directly. In the other 40%, it subcontracts local government functions to the Palestinian Authority. But make no mistake, Israel controls the entire West Bank. Israel controls the borders, Israel controls the airspace, and the Israeli army and the army of no other state can enter every square inch of the West Bank and arrest anyone, anytime it wants. In this territory, which Israel controls, Jews enjoy citizenship, Palestinians don't. Jews can vote in Israeli elections and thus shape the policies of the government that controls their lives. Palestinians cannot. If a Jew and a Palestinian in the West Bank get into a fight, the Jew goes before a civilian court where she enjoys full due process. The Palestinian, by contrast, goes before a military court where she can be held for months or even years without trial, and where the conviction rate, according to a 2011 investigation by the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, exceeds 99%. I want to be clear about what's wrong with this. There is nothing wrong with Jews living in the West Bank, the place where, according to Jewish tradition, our patriarchs and matriarchs are laid to rest. The problem is not that Jews live in the West Bank. It's that they live there with basic democratic rights, which their non-Jewish neighbors are denied. And they live there in this unjust, undemocratic Second Israel, created in 1967, in large measure because the Israeli government pays them to. You can blame the Palestinians for lots of things, but it's not the Palestinians who massively subsidize Israelis to move to the West Bank. In 2012, a study by the Israeli newspaper Yediot Achronot found that the settlements receive 70% more money per person than do cities and towns in Israel proper. 70% more, which helps explain why last year housing construction rose 5% in Israel proper and 130% in settlements in the West Bank. If Bret and Shmuley want to defend the principle that it's okay for a country to grant citizenship and the right to vote to members of one religious and ethnic group, but not to members of another, then be my guest. But my guess is they won't justify the lack of democracy in the West Bank. They'll say it's regrettable, but that the settlements are necessary for Israeli security, which sounds fine, except that the settlements aren't necessary for Israeli security. In fact, they harm Israeli security. Let me explain why. First, from a narrowly military point of view, settlements represent a serious potential liability for the State of Israel. Remember, we're not talking now about keeping the Israeli army in the West Bank. That's not my point right now. We're talking about paying Israeli civilians to move into the West Bank. Let's imagine that, God forbid, Arab armies were to invade the West Bank. Having isolated outposts of Israeli settlements in a territory under attack by a foreign army would be a security nightmare for the Israel Defense Forces. Second, paying Israeli civilians to move into the West Bank strengthens Israel's greatest enemies, Hezbollah, Hamas, and Iran. Here's why. There is a split in the Palestinian and broader Arab world. It's not between people who love Israel and people who don't love Israel. I think it's fair to say that there are very few Palestinians and Arabs who are thrilled that a Jewish state was created in their midst in 1948. The real split is rather between people who can accept Israel's existence, not because they love it, but because they know it's not going anywhere, if Palestinians get the right and dignity that comes with a state of their own. The split is between them on the one hand, and on the other, people who are willing to fight for 100 years, no matter how many people die, to destroy the State of Israel. We can debate whether the divide is 50-50, or 75-25, or even 90-10, but there's a divide. You can see it in the polling of Khalil Shikaki, the most prominent Palestinian pollster, who shows that Palestinians, by a narrow margin, support 2 states over 1 state. Palestinians and Arabs more generally are split. And in this split, the settlements dramatically empower the people Israel should fear most. They allow Hezbollah and Hamas and Iran to say to people like Mahmoud Abbas and Salam Fayyad, you're willing to accept Israel if Israel allows the creation of a Palestinian state? Well, you're fools, because Israel will never allow the creation of a Palestinian state. Look at all the money Israel is pumping into building more settlements that make a viable Palestinian state impossible. And the settlements absolutely do make a viable Palestinian state much, much harder. Just one example. The fourth largest settlement is Ariel. Thanks to vast government subsidies, it now contains 20,000 people. Benjamin Netanyahu recently succeeded in establishing a full-fledged university there. He's called it, quote, the heart of our country, unquote. It's in one of the so-called consensus settlement blocks that supposedly, quote, everyone knows will become part of Israel in a peace agreement. Except that Ariel is incompatible with a viable Palestinian state. Why? Look at a map. Ariel juts almost halfway across the West Bank, cutting off the northern Palestinian cities of Qalqilia and Tulkarm from the west of the West Bank. Even Shlomo Ben Ami, who was Ehud Barak's foreign minister, has said that Ariel, quote, makes the contiguity of a Palestinian state very hard to imagine, unquote. And that's just Ariel. Remember, I'm not talking about some remote, radical place. I'm talking about one of the most mainstream, largest settlements that Israel has built. By continuing to pay Israelis to move into settlements like Ariel, you're making the two-state solution impossible and giving a tremendous gift to those people who want, either via military force or via boycott, divestment, and sanction, to end Israel as a Jewish state. That's not just my view. It's the view of many top former Israeli security officials. I have never heard a senior Israeli security professional say that the settlements benefit Israel's security. Here's what they do say, quote, we are making the lives of millions unbearable, and it kills me. That's Carmi Gilon, who ran the Shin Bet, the Israeli security service that oversees the West Bank, from 1995 to 1996. Quote, we have to choose between the concept of Israel as a Jewish democracy or settlements all over the country, unquote. That's Ami Ayalon, who ran the Shin Bet from 1996 to 2000. Quote, I would like to see a national home that is not maintained by occupying another people. Settlements are bringing us to a point of no return from which the two-state solution is no longer an option, unquote. That's Yuval Diskin, who ran the Shin Bet from 2005 to 2011. These men are not Zaybars-eating liberals, but these are men who saw firsthand, day in and day out, the way Israeli settlement policies harm Palestinians and threatens Israel's future as a democratic Jewish state. And they believe in Israel's Declaration of Independence, which says that this state, born in the shadow of the Holocaust, will offer, quote, complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of race, religion, and sex, and pursue freedom, justice, and peace as envisaged by the Hebrew prophets, unquote. In the name of that document, one of the great documents of Jewish history, I believe that Israeli settlement policies are unjust, undemocratic, and a threat to the survival of the Jewish state that I love. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, now we're going to hear from Mr. Stevens.
So I'm a Zaybars-eating liberal. Unapologetically so. And I'm going to try to convince you. Do you mind passing me my watch so I can keep track of time? That all Zaybars-eating liberals should share my view, and probably Shmuley's view too. I'll let him speak for himself. I was listening to Peter, and I was thinking about how nice it would be if settlements were the core of the problem, of the conflict between Israel and its Palestinian neighbors. You often hear people say, you could solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in 1 minute. Jeremy Ben-Ami, head of J Street, likes to say that. 1 minute. Think of it. This conflict has been going on for 67 years, and yet Jeremy Ben-Ami and Peter thinks it's solvable in 1 minute. It's amazing. Well, when you misdiagnose the problem, and you think that all you need to solve a 67-year conflict is a 1-minute solution, well, maybe you should think about what the nature of the problem is. When I was young, I was the editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post. God knows how I got that job. Bribes. That was a joke, Phil. And this was during the height of the Second Intifada, 2002, 2003, 2004. Hundreds of Israelis were being killed in the street every single day. I don't know if Peter or Hussein have ever actually witnessed a suicide bombing. How many people in this room have witnessed a suicide bombing? There were about 4 of them within a 500-meter radius of the apartment I shared with my wife and our first child. And I saw one up close about a minute after it happened. I didn't realize how much blood the human body contains. It's a gruesome business. When I was the editor of the Jerusalem Post, I decided, although it was a right-of-center newspaper owned by Conrad Black at the time, that I would, as the editor, support Ariel Sharon's policy of disengagement from Gaza. This was a hugely controversial, fraught enterprise by a right-wing, famously right-wing Israeli prime minister to dismantle and destroy every single settlement in Gaza, 22 settlements, almost 20,000 settlers. And why did I support disengagement? Well, maybe at the time, when I was young and innocent, I had Peter's views. And I thought, if you withdraw these settlements, maybe there will be peace. At least there will be a test case for what peace might look like. At least it will give the Palestinians an opportunity to showcase not only to Israel but to the rest of the world what they can do with a Palestinian state. People talk about how tiny Gaza is, but it's not particularly smaller than Singapore or Hong Kong. Small countries can be great countries. You can do a lot when you have a coastline, when you have a talented population. And also, by the way, and contrary to what Peter said, when you have a border, as Gaza does, with a neighboring Arab state. Israel does not control, and Israel controversially got out of the business of controlling the border between the Gaza Strip and Egypt itself. So it's a lie, or it's misinformation, or it's untrue, I don't want to say it's a lie, that Israel controls all of Gaza's borders. It doesn't. So we had a demonstration of what a Palestinian state would look like. Israel withdrew in 2005. Within a year, Gaza was in a civil war between the two factions, Hamas and Fatah. Ultimately, that civil war ended when Hamas threw Fatah officials off of tall buildings and took control of the territory. Where was the showcase Palestinian state saying, look at what we're going to do as a people, what we're going to do as a nation? We were seeing a very different kind of showcase. One of the reasons I believe that Israel should get out of Gaza is I thought Israelis would be more secure behind established 1967 lines than they would be by having this and that settlement going through Gaza in the way that Ariel, for instance, now cuts through the West Bank. And yet, after Israel's withdrawal, it has suffered 8,200 rocket and mortar attacks. 8,200. Do you think that Israelis just gratuitously decide to spend tens of billions of dollars to build schools with reinforced concrete, bomb shelters no more than 15-minute walks away because they enjoy this, because they think it's fun? No, they build it because Gaza, far from being a showcase of what a Palestinian state could be at its best, is a test case for what a Palestinian state might look like, or probably will look like, at its worst. So I wish honestly, that we were having a discussion about settlements, because what would be easier? If you were to tell me Israel's conflict with the Palestinians is a purely territorial conflict, we'll get out of the settlements and have peace. Am I offended that I'm not in possession of Winnipeg as an American? Am I bothered that our border is the 49th parallel as opposed to the 50th parallel west of the Great Lakes? No, I could care less. Canada is a liberal democracy. I can travel there anytime I want. The worst I have to do is like hockey. We don't think about our border with Canada because Canada is a state that doesn't threaten us, that shares our values, where people are free. And I would welcome a Palestinian state that would look like Canada. Don't laugh. Whoever laughed, don't laugh. Don't laugh. We should not have, forgive the quote, or the source of the quote, the soft bigotry of low expectations with respect to the Palestinians. Why can't they be like Canadians? Leaving aside soccer or hockey. Why can't they be like Canadians? Why are we not saying, you know, there are lots of stateless people in the world. The Kurds have been around at least as long as the Jews have. They don't have a state. I once spent an interesting month in Sri Lanka. The Tamils want a state there. They don't have a state. There are all kinds of stateless people in the world. What is the claim for any number of people to have a state? Maybe it's to demonstrate that they will know what to do with that state. That a Palestinian state won't instantly become another Yemen, or another Zimbabwe, or another Iran. So I would love to accept Peter's hypothesis or thesis that this is all about settlements. It would be solved tomorrow. It would be solved in 1 minute. But this is not about settlements. This is about existence. This is about what a frightening number of Palestinians think about the legitimacy of a Jewish state of Israel in any borders. 1967 or 1948. Now, when it's an existential conflict, it's much harder to solve. It's very hard. It's very hard to make peace with a people who welcome as heroes, as Mahmoud Abbas did just a few months ago, 26 people whose achievement had been that they had gone to Israeli towns and cities and murdered elderly Jewish people. There was a huge story. I don't know how many of you read the New York Times. My wife writes for it, so I like it. There was a big story in the Times just on Sunday, Jody Rudoran, about a fellow by the name of Muqdad Salah. What did Muqdad Salah do? Well, in 1993 or 1994, he was trying to hunt down a person he accused of being a Palestinian collaborator, went into an Israeli town, couldn't find the collaborator, but figured that he didn't want to make his trip an entire way, so he found a sleeping 72-year-old Holocaust survivor, took an iron bar and clubbed him to death. Now he's free, he just got married. There were pictures in the Times of people celebrating his marriage in Nablus. Now, all kinds of murderers go free in all kinds of cities and towns and countries, but I don't know many countries where people who kill old people are celebrated as national heroes. There is a culture of hate in the Palestinian community that should not be ignored, should not be downplayed. I read Peter's book, The Crisis of Zionism. It's an interesting book. He's a master of the word but. He will acknowledge something like Hamas's charter calls for Muslims to murder Jews. But Hamas is making interesting overtures in the department of maybe having a long-term truce with Israel. Just a few weeks ago, we had a fascinating story. An Israeli naval commandos stopped a ship in the middle of the Red Sea carrying large rockets destined for Gaza. What were these rockets for? There was another story about this immense tunnel that was built underneath Gaza into Israel. What for? To kidnap Israelis. Just think of how much Gaza might have developed since 2005, since Israel's withdrawal, if it had been investing those efforts, that labor, that money, not into building tunnels to kidnap Israelis, not into purchasing weapons from Iran, but into developing their human capital, into becoming a progressive and moderate and reasonable state. Now, one of the funny things about this debate we're having is that Peter's supposed to be the liberal here, and Hussein as well, and Shmuley and I are the conservatives. That's wrong. That's wrong. That's not right. I don't know how many young women here are runners, like to go out for a jog. Well, in 2012 or 13, there was supposed to be a marathon organized by the UN in Gaza. It was canceled. Why? Because of the possibility that young women would want to run the marathon in shorts. Think about that. Years ago, oh, sorry, I didn't realize it's time. Years ago, I'll finish with this thought. Years ago, I was watching protesters at a huge London rally against the war in Iraq, and someone was holding a banner, and it said, "Queers for Palestine," which is fine. It's wonderful. But I wanted to know if that person knew what happened to gay people in Palestine. You should worry about a state, or a would-be state, that murders gays, oppresses women, hates its neighbor. We want a Palestinian state that looks like Canada, not like Iran. Thank you.
I'm going to return to the subject and resist the temptation, the enormous temptations put in front of me by Mr. Stevens here, and I'm going to address those as best I can during the rebuttal. So I'll just stick to the topic, which is, are Israel's policies justified in light of the security issues that it faces? And I think clearly the answer can only be no, both morally and strategically. So it depends on whichever, we can look at it both ways or singly, but either way we're going to come out the same place. These two imperatives come together perfectly in the occupation, and the policies that Israel is pursuing that are plainly deepening and entrenching, especially through further settlement building and similar measures, rather than easing or ending the occupation. There are, in fact, two Israels. The de jure state of Israel inside its 1967 borders, which is a member state of the United Nations and has a Jewish majority and a flawed but democratic political system. But there's also the de facto state of Israel, which involves all the areas that have come under Israel's control since 1967, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Golan Heights, and the Gaza Strip. Combined with the de jure Israel is the de facto Israel, all right? And that de facto Israel operates a settlement project that is in total violation of black-letter international law and that is strenuously objected to by the international community. It already has more Arabs than Jews in it, and therefore the de facto state of Israel is not Jewish in any meaningful sense. If anybody doubts that, ask me during the Q&A and I'll break down the stats for you, but there's no doubt about it. And finally, it is highly undemocratic in that it completely disenfranchises at least 4.5 million people living under its jurisdiction, the Palestinians in the occupied territories. Now, as many, and not least among them, a consensus of former senior Israeli security officials have concluded, the only existential threat to the de jure Israel is the de facto Israel. And the only way we can speak of Israel meaningfully at all is to assume that the occupation is a temporary, anomalous condition that's going to be addressed in the future. Otherwise, we're not talking about anything anyone imagines as Israel. We're talking about a completely different country with a completely different system. But the problem is, at most registers of reality, that's what exists today. It's the de facto state of Israel that's the core reality on the ground, not the de jure one. The existential threat that the occupation poses to Israel does not merely arise from the fact that it has already negated Israel's Jewish majority in its de facto state. Israel's nuclear arsenal and likely second strike capability render it virtually immune from attacks by other states or conventional forces, including Iran. However, Israel has within its direct security control, and as a practical matter inside its own de facto borders, a large population, millions of people, who live under intolerable conditions of disenfranchisement and discrimination. There's nothing like Israel's occupation, particularly in terms of the discrimination it imposes on Palestinians in the West Bank, that I can think of anywhere else in the world today. It's quite unique. Everything you can do in the occupied territories depends on whether the Israeli government classifies you as a Jewish settler or an occupied Palestinian. Every single aspect of daily life is determined by this inevitably ethnic distinction. Where you may live, what roads you can drive on, whether you can be armed for self-defense or not, how much water and other basic necessities you get per capita, what type of education your children will have, whether you can travel freely around your own country or leave it with a normal confidence of being allowed to return, or whether you need the permission of foreign soldiers, many of them just out of high school, to go from one village to another, or whether you may be subjected to midnight house raids, what laws you live under, etc. I could go on until midnight. I really could. Now, does this arrangement sound like the basis for a reasonable security policy to you? I mean, really? Because that's how it's conceptualized, right? As a forward basis in enemy territory. And this is Israel's strategic depth. We hear it all the time from people except Israeli security professionals who don't see it that way. The bottom line is that in the occupied territories, Palestinians who are citizens of no state live under one set of laws and conditions, and Israeli, in fact, as Peter described, and Israeli settlers, even standing next to each other, live under another. Settlers are Israeli citizens with all the rights and responsibilities that come with that. The Palestinians have neither. Millions of people have been living like this for almost 50 years, and the vast majority of the history of the modern Israeli state. Now, I want to put to you, there's not a single person in this room, not one of you, who would accept to live like that generation after generation, decade after decade, with no end in sight. You would resist in an intelligent manner, hopefully, and you would not put up with it. And if you think you would put up with it, you're lying to yourselves. Pro tip, don't put anybody else in that situation either. Okay, now, unlike my fellow panelists, I was born in the Middle East. I grew up mainly in West Beirut, surrounded by Palestinians. When I was a child and a teenager, the PLO was mainly based in and near my area of that city. And I was inculcated with the Palestinian cause and narrative by Palestinians and others from my birth. I got it with my mother's milk, which is exactly how I come to be standing here today, because I continue to work in that cause here in the United States, and I don't think a working day goes by or has gone by in the last 15 years of my professional life in Washington where I haven't been working for or closely with Palestinians, and it was true in the Middle East as well. So there are two things I can tell you from this experience which nobody else on this panel has. First, I am sure that the Palestinians are ready for peace. Not all the Palestinians by any means, nor all the Israelis, but the vast majority of Palestinians want a two-state solution, and they have been making that clear in word and deed for the past few decades, even during the worst violence, the worst despair. And there always have been more Palestinian civilians killed during any period of violence than Israelis. Palestinians have stuck to this goal because it's necessary. But it's equally necessary for Israel because the only thing you can be sure of is just as you would not submit to live under conditions of extreme discrimination and disenfranchisement for generations, neither will they. We've already had two uprisings. Bret described the grim results on one side. I would not regale you with gory details on the other. I could, but I won't. Let's just say that everyone remembers how counterproductive they are, which is probably the main reason we haven't had a third, but eventually something's got to give. The Palestinians are losing hope in a two-state solution. They see increased settlements, more walls going up around them. They see their land being gobbled up for new colonies or military installations. And they hear the words of senior Israeli cabinet ministers ruling out an agreement. And they hear angry agitation from their own far left and their own far right. And ultimately, ruling over such a population is a moral and strategic disaster for Israel. The occupation is also costing Israel dear in terms of the dramatically changing Middle Eastern regional landscape. Israel suddenly finds itself with common interests, particularly vis-a-vis Iran, with key Arab states such as Saudi Arabia and its Gulf allies, Egypt and others. But the occupation is something that prevents more robust and open cooperation on that issue. And this is especially tragic given the neglected overture of the Arab Peace Initiative, which promises normalization with Israel by the entire Arab world in the event of a peace treaty with the Palestinians. But as long as the Israeli government continues to place settlement and occupation above its actual strategic interests, it will be impossible to take advantage of this extraordinary moment, and it will remain isolated in a region in which it now has a time-limited but golden opportunity to forge new strategic relations. I urge everybody in this audience to go and listen to the words of a virtual unanimity of former Israeli security officials, most concisely collected and expressed, although not exclusively by any means, in the film The Gatekeepers. The settlements are not a strategic forward position into enemy territory. They are a security nightmare, okay? Politically, they have created a shadow version of Israel that is neither Jewish nor democratic, and without a Palestinian state, Israel is forced to fall back on a fortress mentality. And this has been its reaction to the Arab Spring. Retreat inside, circle the wagons, build more walls, iron domes, acquire more weapons, hunker down, and assume a reactive defensive crouch within the borders of the non-Jewish and non-democratic Greater Israel de facto. Now, Israel's security approach seems to me entirely without a vision, all tactics and no strategy. More walls and anti-missile systems are band-aids on a cancer. Only peace can provide lasting security, not new infrastructure or more technology, and Israel's retired security professionals are the first to say this. It's completely inexplicable from a security perspective that Israel would be busily digging the hole that it finds itself and the Palestinians trapped in even deeper with more settlement activity and more entrenchment of the occupation. I mean, if Israel really wants peace with the Palestinians, why on earth is it building more settlements or expanding existing ones? Keeping millions of people stateless, colonized, and without their basic human rights is not only unjust, it's reckless. It's dicing with Israel's own future and that of two peoples and the entire region. And I can assure you that most of the Palestinians and the other Arabs are eager for an alternative that actually would provide security, which is peace. But that would require ending the occupation. Thank you very much.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I believe in make love and not war. Most of you know me from my books like Kosher Sex, my television show Shalom in the Home, and I would much rather be speaking to you today about my new book, Kosher Lust, available at fine bookstores everywhere, that was just released, than talking about a conflict with brothers like Hussein Ibish. I believe, as what the Bible says in the first chapter of Genesis, that every human being, Arab and Jew alike, is created equally in the image of God. But I am a love prophet on loan to the defense of the state of Israel because I'm just astonished at what's happening. The hypocrisy, the double standards, the absolute lies that are told about the Jewish state, especially on campus. And where are its defenders? And if tonight can help spur more people to speak out about that hypocrisy, then we will have been successful. For example, my dear friend Peter Beinart wants a boycott of products from the West Bank, like soda pop from SodaStream. Does he use an iPhone? It's assembled in China, which has occupied Tibet since 1951. Is he boycotting Apple? Hussein Ibish will tell you that Israel is occupying the Palestinians. He will omit to tell you this simple history and the facts, that in 1936, the Palestinians and the Arabs rejected the Peel Commission report to divide the land into two states. They rejected the 1947 UN partition plan. Israel returned all of the Sinai Desert after the 1956 campaign. In 1967, when Israel conquered land 3 times its size, leading to these disputed territories, Moshe Dayan approached the Arabs and said, we're prepared to give it all back. And they responded with an Arab League summit in Khartoum in Sudan with the three famous no's: no negotiations, no peace, no recognition. Fast forward to 79 and the Camp David Accords, which again was rejected by the Palestinians. And Sadat was murdered for making peace with Israel when Israel gave back land 3 times its size in returning Sinai. Fast forward to the 93 Oslo Accords, when Israel gave control of all Palestinians living in the West Bank, 97% of Palestinians under Palestinian control. And the response was, after Oslo I and Oslo II, a murder wave of Israeli citizens that claimed the lives of 1,000 Israelis, buses blown up, nurseries decimated, pregnant women dismembered. I want you to understand that that's the equivalent of 70,000 Americans being killed. And look at how the United States responded to 3,000 New Yorkers dying. The 9/11/2001. I want to use as a small example, and by the way, then of course there's the rejection by Yasser Arafat of the second Camp David Accords with Bill Clinton in 2000, where Bill Clinton pointed a finger at him, and he wrote the introduction to your book, Peter. He told Arafat, you have made me into a failure. You are responsible for the end of these talks, notwithstanding what you say in your book, Peter. Then 2008, Ehud Barak, the same thing. With Olmert, tried to give back 97% of the West Bank, and the Palestinians rejected the deal. I want to just demonstrate from Peter's own book the kind of misconceptions that have to be responded to. First, Peter says to us that the Jews celebrate Purim. Persia's Jews had a license to do to Haman's people what Haman wanted to do to them. And the Jews slaughtered 75,000 souls. The Jews slaughtered 75,000 souls. But if you read in the same book, you'll discover that the Jews didn't slaughter anyone. They defended themselves against a genocidal attack, as the book itself says, that Achashverosh gave them the right to destroy, to slay, and to cause to perish the forces of the people that would assault them and their babies and their women. That's the only thing Israel has ever done. It's just tried to defend itself from a genocidal assault. Peter says, we are not history's permanent victims. In a dizzying shift of fortune, many of our greatest challenges today stem not from weakness, but from power. Power? You mean Israel's biggest problem is that it's too powerful? Tell that to Hezbollah, that owns all of southern Lebanon and drops rockets into Israel, slaughtering and maiming civilians. Tell that to the Israelis who live in Sderot and the 35% of children who have post-traumatic stress disorder from the thousands upon thousands of rockets that came from Gaza. There's no occupation in Gaza. Peter writes that Gaza is still occupied. Why? Because of a naval blockade? The United States blockaded Cuba. That wasn't called an occupation. There isn't an Israeli troop in Gaza. There isn't an Israeli citizen in Gaza. There is only Hamas, a terrorist organization with a genocidal charter calling not for the murder of Israelis, by the way, but the murder of every Jew everywhere in the world, wherever they may be found. As the Hamas charter famously says, that trees will call out to Muslims and say to them, there is a Jew hiding behind me, come and kill him. Peter says, this is amazing. He even blames Israel for Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Erdogan just shut down Facebook, Twitter, all social media in Turkey. He is a dictator, murderer, menace to his people. But this is what Peter says about it. You know who created him? Israel. Turkey only began shunning the Jewish state after Israel's 2009 war in Gaza. That is astonishing. So now Israel's even responsible for Muslim dictators who've dismantled democracy in their own lands. He actually writes, Israeli jets never bombed Auschwitz and never will. What they have bombed in recent years is the Gaza Strip. A fenced-in, hideously overcrowded, desperately poor slum from which terrorist groups sometimes shell Israel. Number one, those terror groups continually shell Israel. Number two, I visited Gaza City with the Reverend Al Sharpton, who I took on a solidarity mission to Israel right after the attacks of 9/11. I saw the squalor. I saw the suffering of my Palestinian brothers and sisters. I want you to know that Palestinians in Gaza have now received more per capita foreign aid than any people in the history of the world. So why is it a slum? Why is it so overcrowded? Because Hamas used all of that money to buy bullets and bombs to kill Jews rather than to build universities, rather than to build roads. Their hatred of the Jews is such that they would rather slaughter Israelis than care about their own people. But it's astonishing that Peter would say that Israel should not defend itself against those rockets. And then there's Peter's, and this is the nature of the problem. If we're talking about whether Israel's policies actually allow them to pursue, for Israel to address its security needs, Peter he barely sees security needs. He actually says this: discussing the Hamas charter is important. People should read it. But listening to American Jewish organizations, one would never know that Hamas has in recent years issued several new documents which are more compatible with the two-state solution. I would even ask Hussein Ibish to please answer this question. Would you, an eloquent defender of your people, which I greatly respect, by the way, I respect that you're a champion of your people, would you ever agree in 1 million years to live under Hamas in Gaza? Ever? Would you ever live? So in other words, we're supposed to trust Hamas with new statements. They have a genocidal charter against the Jews. They pursue honor killings against women. By the way, I want to show this to you. We've been working to try to help rescue a woman. This is today's New York Times and last week's New York Times. A woman who's facing an honor killing in Afghanistan. Honor killings are a regular occurrence in Gaza. We're supposed to trust Hamas when they say that they now want to somehow accept Israel. I mean, I find this astonishing. We're supposed to trust terrorist organizations. What if Al-Qaeda started ameliorating their language against Israel? Peter even wants Israel to accept, quote, an international peacekeeping force in the Jordan Valley. And Israel will, quote, have all the advantages it did not have in 1967, an international peacekeeping force. We saw in the Holocaust that the Jews can unfortunately rely only on themselves when it comes to their security. I have a friend named President Paul Kagame. He's the president of Rwanda. He's controversial because he insists on defending his people as well. In 7 days' time, it's the 20th anniversary of the Rwandan genocide. The president has asked me to give the prayer at the 20th commemoration that will be attended by people like Bill Clinton, Bill Gates, etc. He is insistent as well that he will never trust the United Nations to protect it. And Peter knows that we Jews have learned that we are the ones who have to protect ourselves. Now, let me tell you the truth about what could create peace. The dispute between Arabs and Jews is not one about territories. There are only 5 main settlement blocks that occupy, if we want to use those words of the other side, 7% of the entire West Bank, 7%. Israel dismantled all of its settlements in Sinai when it returned to Egypt. It dismantled all of its settlements in Gaza. There was no occupation, again, from 48 to 67. There is no occupation in Gaza. This is a farce. It's not about settlements. The real issue is values. Let me tell you about the Islam that I look up to and respect. In the year 1098, the first Crusaders came, conquered Jerusalem, and they slaughtered every single Jew living in Jerusalem. In the year 1187, Sultan Salah al-Din came and invited the Jews to come back, and he treated them as equals. The Quran says beautifully in Surah 6, verse 151, take no life because Allah has made them all sacred. The Quran says in Surah 49:11, O ye who believe, let not any nation laugh at another nation. Peace will come when our Arab brothers and sisters and Palestinians condemn acts of terror against Israelis as much as we condemned the Jewish terrorist Baruch Goldstein, who killed 29 innocent Palestinians on Purim 20 years ago in 1994. And my house was firebombed the very next night in Oxford. I don't know if Peter was still a Rhodes Scholar back then. Peace will come when terrorists don't have squares named after them the way they are named after them today in the West Bank by Mahmoud Abbas himself. Peace will come when terrorists are not given $100,000 as the terrorist who Bret just quoted was given as soon as he arrived from prison. Peace will come when the values of our Palestinian brothers and sisters reflect the true nature of the Quran, a religion of life, a religion of peace, not a religion of hatred of Jews, not a religion of anti-Semitism, and not a religion that says that Jews have no right to live anywhere in Israel. Let me finally say that Peter has to acknowledge, he said in his book that Palestinian leaders said that if there is a Palestinian state, that Jewish settlers can live there. He actually says that. when in July 31st, 2013, Mahmoud Abbas famously said that no Jew and no Israeli will be allowed to live in a Palestinian state, and the official Palestinian Authority penalty for selling land to a Jew is the death penalty. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think what we'll do is we'll keep the same order for the rebuttal. Peter, would you like to start?
Yeah, I have to say, Shmuley has an interesting concept of civil debate. He completely ignored the resolution and launched into an ad hominem attack on me and my book. If you wanted to have a debate on my book, we can have a debate about my book. Just to give you just a brief sense of how wildly Shmuley mischaracterizes the book, let me just read you from one paragraph in the book. In a nation that has lived since its creation with the ever-present threat of war, a strain that would have turned countries less nourished by liberal ideals into police states, these, I'm talking about Israel's right to free speech, assembly, worship, are impressive accomplishments. It is far from clear, here this is me writing about Israel, that under similar circumstances, any of the democracies that criticize Israel's human rights records would have done better. Certainly no one familiar with the way the United States government treated German Americans during World War I, Japanese Americans during World War II, or even Muslim Americans during the War on Terror, during wars that, unlike Israel's, mostly took place thousands of miles from America's shores, has any cause for sanctimony. So, and in fact, my book, and I've said repeatedly that Israel does have the right to self-defense. So why does Shmuley have to so massively mischaracterize my position? Because he's doing the same thing that Bret's doing. He's trying to distract you. Hussein and I made... You want to have a debate about China and iPhones? We're making a very, very specific claim here. The claim is not that Israel should not defend itself. The claim is that Israel's policies of making increasingly permanent its control over the West Bank by paying people to move from democratic into non-democratic Israel. Shmuley and Bret argued everything but the contention that we laid out. Bret and Shmuley both said it's not that I had claimed that this was a purely territorial issue. That's not what I said at all. I said, in fact, that it is both a territorial and an existential issue. That unless Shmuley and Bret want to suggest that 100% of Palestinians can never accept Israel with any borders, something which is contradicted by all of the public opinion data we have, it matters a great deal that Israel strengthen the hands of those Palestinians who do see this as a territorial threat, not because they love Israel, but because they have come to the painful, from their point of view, realization that they're better off taking a state on 22% of British mandatory Palestine than fighting forever for all of it. It is very much in Israel's interest that it weaken those people who see this as an existential issue and want to fight forever to destroy the whole state of Israel. And the tragedy of the policies that Shmuley and Bret are proposing is that they are exactly the policies that Hezbollah and Hamas want Israel to pursue. Because when you take a leader like Mahmoud Abbas or Salam Fayyad, who have publicly recognized Israel's right to exist and have said that they will only pursue nonviolent measures to support the Palestinian struggle, and you make them failures, which is what Salam Fayyad said very explicitly when he left Palestinian politics. He said, read the interview he did with Roger Cohen, Benjamin Netanyahu made me a failure. Then you massively strengthen those Palestinians who do see this as an existential issue, who are willing to fight forever to destroy the state of Israel. You create the very reality that Israel should most fear. Bret talked a lot about the Gaza withdrawal as a test case. It's for a peace agreement. It's not a test case for a peace agreement. There was no peace agreement. That was precisely the problem with the Palestinians would never have accepted a peace agreement in which Israel withdrew its settlers from Gaza and doubled down in the West Bank. If you want to look at precedents for a peace agreement, you have to look at Israel's peace agreements. Israel has signed peace agreements with Jordan and Egypt, two countries where most of the people are not crazy about the state of Israel, and those peace agreements have held now for decades. We can't predict the future, but Israel has benefited tremendously from those peace agreements. In Egypt, they held an election. The most anti-Israel candidate, Mohammed Morsi, won that election. And even during the period that Morsi was in power, the peace treaty remained. They didn't even withdraw their ambassador from Israel during the violence with Gaza. So to compare to say a unilateral withdrawal is the precedent for a peace agreement gets it exactly wrong. I don't advocate a unilateral Israeli withdrawal. A unilateral Israeli withdrawal obligates the Palestinians to nothing, and Israel would never make a unilateral withdrawal that the Palestinians could be satisfied with. But Israel's record of actual peace agreements has been very good. I want to say something about this question of the culture of hate that we've heard a lot about the idea of celebrating terrorists as Palestinians unfortunately have, something that I think that no Palestinian should do. There is, Shmuley mentioned Baruch Goldstein. If you go to the settlement of Kiryat Arba, you can go to the park which is named for Meir Kahane and see in the middle of that park, a publicly maintained park, the shrine to Baruch Goldstein. I don't know if anyone here knows who David Raziel is. David Raziel is a guy who in 1938 put bombs in the Arab market in Haifa and killed 22 people. Why do I mention him? Well, he's on an Israeli postage stamp. There's a moshav named after him, and there's a street named after him in the Talpiot neighbor of Jerusalem. That man was a terrorist too. He was a terrorist in the Irgun. I'm not saying this. The reason I'm saying this is both societies have a hate problem. When polls show that 56% of Israeli high school students and 82% of Israeli religious high school students don't want Arab Israelis to be able to run for the Knesset. When the Truman Institute at Hebrew University finds that 44% of Israeli Jews say that Jews should not rent apartments to Arabs, there is a hate problem on both sides. I'm not saying it's exactly the same, but there is a hate problem on both sides. And the driver of this hatred on both sides is violence. The terrible, terrible violence of Palestinian terrorism, the suicide bombing which claimed the friend of mine who I always thought would be the rabbi at my wedding, but also the violence of Israeli undemocratic control over the West Bank, in which people are systematically humiliated by not having, for generations and generations, the basic rights that all of us would want. And Shmuley has offered, despite his lavish praise on Islam as a religion, he has given no indication whatsoever that he thinks there is any problem with holding millions of people permanently without citizenship, the right to vote, the right to free movement, and the right to due process. That seems to me ultimately what's at the heart of this debate.
I think that what Peter said was just so slippery it should be marketed as a lubricant. But it's accurate. You know, we've heard a lot about the absence of democracy in the West Bank and Gaza. I don't know about Peter. I'm a journalist. Peter's a professor of journalism. But I was in Gaza, also the West Bank, in 2005 for the election of President Mahmoud Abbas. And if you want, you can look it up. A column I wrote called From Strongman to Goodman, about the transition from Yasser Arafat to Mahmoud Abbas. I had high hopes for the moderate, then Prime Minister, soon to be President of the Palestinian state. I'm astonished now that I read that column how wrong I was. There was an election in 2005. There was supposed to be an election in 2009. What happened to that election? Where is the democracy? I mean, we elected Barack Obama in 2008. We elected him again in 2012. That's democracy. One man, one vote, one time is not democracy. So when we're talking about democracy, let's remember that the most flagrant violation of democratic norms is happening among the Palestinians by a president who rules essentially by decree and whose term of office expired more than 5 years ago without ever bothering to stand for re-election. There was another election in the Palestinian, in the Palestinian Authority a year after the election I witnessed. This was the election that brought Hamas to power. It was a democratic election. Hamas remains, as Shmuley accurately said, sworn not only to the destruction of Israel, but to killing Jews wherever they might be found. So where there's actual democracy, I'm not talking about Khalil Shikaki's opinion polls, okay? Opinion polls can tell you anything you want, and anyone here with half a brain who studies politics knows this. I'm not talking about opinion polls. When there have been elections, we've learned something about Palestinian political preferences, and we've also learned something about what happens when supposedly moderate leaders like Mahmoud Abbas find democracy inconvenient. There was an Oslo process and an Oslo Accord which created a Palestinian Authority under which the overwhelming majority of Palestinians live. There is no democracy there. There is no liberalism there. There are no liberal values there. There are liberals, but you don't hear from them because they are at risk for their lives. One of the things that I found interesting was listening to Peter quote all kinds of Israeli security officials saying this, that, and the other about what Israel should do in the interests of its security. Why do I never hear that kind of debate among Palestinians? No, we listen, but the debate is between Hamas and Fatah, okay? Where is the liberal democratic Palestinian candidate, all right, who's saying, enough with armed struggle, enough with the resistance, we have to accept that Israel is going to stay here forever. There's supposedly a majority. I'd love to think they're a majority. It's a wonderful thought. But when given an opportunity to express their views, Palestinians voted for Hamas. This is a fact from which you cannot look away. So when we talk about democracy, let's ask ourselves what Palestinian democracy looks like now and what it's likely to look like in the future. Let me make one final point. Both in 1999 and then again in 2008 or 9, Israel came very close to relinquishing the Golan Heights. It didn't happen for complicated reasons, which I won't get into now. What would Israel's security be today if it had relinquished the Golan Heights? If chemical weapons were now being used 1,000 feet above the Israeli valley below? This is why Israelis, not just the selective Israelis quoted by our partners here in the debate, but why serious Israeli security thinkers worry about this issue of territory. If the idea of a Syrian civil war happening right now in the Golan Heights concerns any one of you, you might also think about what happens when Israel's borders are Lebanon in the north, Gaza in the south, an ungoverned Sinai further south, and then a West Bank that looks like Gaza today. Israelis are not crazy. They're not stupid. And I'll give them the respect of thinking that their security dilemmas are a little more complicated than Hussein and Peter will make out.
Let me begin where Bret left off. This is the fascinating erasure of logic that happens with the grabbing of territory. Okay, so if Israel did not possess the Golan Heights, then there might have been a civil war near Israel's borders that involved the use of chemical weapons. Well, Bret, maybe you didn't hear about it, but Israel has annexed the Golan Heights. So from the Israeli government's point of view, there is a civil war going on next to its borders, and chemical weapons were used. Why? Because Israel annexed the Golan Heights. Now, let's reverse the logic. What if Israel had withdrawn from the Golan Heights, and the chemical weapons are then used once in the middle of Syria, far from Israel? It really makes no sense at all to think that expanding your borders to deeper into your neighbor's territory brings you more security. And I just don't understand why. And the logic that you laid out is faulty, because everything that you said, imagine it could be like this, is exactly like that, if you agree that Israel has annexed the Golan Heights, and I'm sure you do. Now, if you listen to our two colleagues over here, you would think that Hamas was the dominant force in Palestinian politics. They're certainly not. They're barely holding on to power in Gaza right now, and it's because they have predominance of weapons, mainly. I think they've become extremely unpopular. The reason that there hasn't been an election is they won't agree to it because they're terrified of the results, and they're right to be terrified of the results. Now, I don't think you could find, or you'd have a very hard time finding a stronger Arab critic of Hamas than me. I've got nothing good to say about them at all. On any front, I don't like the religious right anywhere at all, and I don't like anybody who engages in violence anywhere at all. But I mean, to sit here and listen to defenders of the Israeli state and the Israeli status quo denouncing a culture of violence. The diagnosis on our side is there's a problem of structural relationship between dominators and subordinates in a hierarchical order that has to do with occupation, where if you reverse roles, you'd have a very similar situation. It's like prisoners and guards, right? Very similar to the study that was done, which randomly assigned people to be prisoners and guards, and then started acting like prisoners and guards. Why? Because it's built in. No, they say no, there's a culture of violence, a culture of terrorism, a culture of killing on the other side. Well, apart from pointing out that at every stage of violence, more Palestinian civilians have been killed by Israelis than the other way around, let's look at what the proto-Israelis, the Jewish Yishuv, was up to in the pre-state era. What did they? Was there no terrorism among Jews? Right. Let me quote from an article called "Terror," which was in the magazine of the Lehi organization's newspaper Hekazit in 1943. Lehi, of course, the organization of Yitzhak Shamir, who was not only honored in Israel, he was prime minister for quite some time, a major figure and deeply honored. So what did this organization say? Quote, "Neither Jewish ethics nor Jewish tradition can disqualify terrorism as a means of combat. We are very far from having any moral qualms as far as our national war goes. We have before us the command of the Torah, whose morality surpasses that of any body of laws in the world, open quote, ye shall blot them out to the last man, close quote. But first and foremost, terrorism is for us a part of the political battle being conducted under the present circumstances, and it has a great part to play. Speaking in a clear voice to the whole world, as well as to our wretched brethren outside this land, it proclaims our war against the occupier." The British, of course. We are particularly far from this sort of hesitation in regard to an enemy whose moral perversion is admitted by all. End of quote. Lehi Yitzhak Shamir's organization in 1943. All right? Now, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a more eloquent defense of terrorism, traditions, and values from the most ruthless man in Hamas. It's pretty extraordinary, and it's not as if this is it's a unique thing. I would, if I were to mention the pre-state terrorism that went into the building of Israel, I would mention the King David Hotel, Deir Yassin, Lord Moyne, Count Bernadette, and keep you bored again until midnight, but I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to cite one really interesting incident, which was in 1940, November 25th, 1940, the Haganah, which became later basically the IDF and this basic structure of the Israeli military, put a bomb on a ship called the SS Patria, which had at least 1,800 Jewish refugees fleeing Europe, and it was moored outside Haifa harbor, and the British wouldn't let them in because they were illegal immigrants and coming against them. This bomb killed between 260 and 300 people. 50 of them were British, crew people. The rest were Jewish refugees. And can you imagine what would be said of Arabs if they had been responsible for blowing up a ship laden with Jewish refugees in Haifa harbor that sat there until 1952, and it was denied absolutely by everyone that there was any Jewish involvement at all in that until finally came out in the mid to late 50s. So please, we really trying to tell us that there's a culture of terrorism, that your side is uniquely messed up, there's something culturally wrong with you, etc., when it's so obvious that there is a structure that would produce exactly the same kind of relationship of dominance and subordination, controller and controlled, jailer and prisoner, anywhere in the world between any two sets of people. Can you not see that? If you can't, you're not using your heads.
The advantage of delivering my rebuttal remarks sitting is that you can't see that I'm shorter than all the other panelists, so I'll use that to my advantage. Hussein, Peter, respectfully, the issue is not which side commits terrorist atrocities. The issue is which side, and that of course is deplorable, condemnable murder. The issue is which side's mainstream population and elected officials condone those atrocities, lionize those atrocities, champion those atrocities. Peter says the Baruch Goldstein has a park named after him.
A shrine.
There was a shrine built on Baruch Goldstein's grave by religious extremists who are an abomination to Judaism, which says thou shalt not murder. And it was destroyed by the Israeli army, period, destroyed. Peter didn't also say that anyone who goes to his grave is watched by the Israeli security forces. Now contrast that with Mahmoud Abbas posthumously bestowing, quote, the Star of Honor on Abu Jihad, who was the architect of the Coastal Road massacre of 38 Israelis, which included 13 children. Contrast that with Mahmoud Abbas, the elected leader of the Palestinian Authority, naming a square after Dalal Mughrabi in 2011, who led that attack that killed 13 children. Hussein, why do you have to reach all the way back prior to the creation of the State of Israel? Why can't you name an Israeli prime minister that got up and said that Goldstein is a hero, that ever justified murdering Palestinians in cold blood? God forbid. The reason? Because Israel is a just and moral democracy that abhors that kind of murderous vigilante action. Israel is a country of laws. And of course, people know that there has to be a solution to the Arab-Israeli conflict, or call it the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is why there are talks going on right now, Peter. You make out as if Israel doesn't acknowledge that there has to be a solution. It's that your solution, as Bret so rightly points out, is to allow the creation of a state right now where there is no democracy, there's a kleptocracy. Mahmoud Abbas has been accused by his own people of stealing $100 million from the Palestinian Authority. His sons, I think Yasser and someone can help me, his son's name, they control the entire, they have a monopoly in all the cigarette trade. They have a monopoly in things like the construction trade. And there hasn't been elections in years. And when Hussein says the reason is that it's Hamas that's afraid of elections, yes, that's not true. The proof of that's not true is the fact that Mahmoud Abbas has not gone to Gaza to campaign or show his face since 2006. He hasn't even gone there. Why? Because he's afraid for his life. That's why. Because he's afraid he might not come out alive. That's why. Because even Mahmoud Abbas knows he has no control over Hamas. And if we were to do what Peter says, there would not be a two-state solution. There would be at least a three-state solution, maybe a 4 or 5-state solution, because Hamas is not going to listen to a word. Who's ever heard of a president of the Palestinian Authority who will not travel the 20 kilometers to Gaza since 2006, in 8 years? Peter writes, and this is my issue with Peter.
Is this debate about me or about the topic?
Well, I mean, we're debating tonight, so it's partially about you, yeah. Peter actually says that Bibi calling Palestinian terrorist groups, Nazis, is what kind of incites them to be just that. Let's just remember for a moment. It was Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Mufti of Jerusalem, who met with Hitler, who asked Hitler in 1941 to implement the final solution in the Middle East, killing every single Jew. Let's remember that it was people like Gamal Abdel Nasser who repeatedly said he was going to exterminate Israel, push it into the ocean, slaughter everyone. Let's remember terrible sermons that are given by mainstream Palestinian Authority imams, like this one by Sheikh Ibrahim Mahdi, Friday's sermon on television, live in April 12, 2002. Oh Allah, accept our martyrs in the highest heavens. Oh Allah, show the Jews a black day. Oh Allah, annihilate the Jews and their supporters. Oh Allah, raise the flag of jihad across the land. Oh Allah, forgive our sins. Hussein, let's at least agree that both sides should utterly condemn any call for genocide and incitement and murder against innocent civilians. And that means that there is that saying occupation is the reason for these attacks or humiliation or checkpoints. I'm sorry. The Dalai Lama has seen his country occupied since '51. He doesn't blow people up, okay? The Jews experienced the worst humiliation, murder, slaughter, genocide at the hands of the Nazis. They didn't blow up German buses and nurseries. There is no excuse for Palestinian terrorism, period.
I agree.
I think that given the time, I've tried very hard, but as you see, it was very difficult because everybody was so excited about what they were saying to keep everybody exactly. So I think what I'll do is I'll change the format just a little bit to give the audience a chance for Q&A and then save the last 10 minutes for concluding remarks by the speakers. All right. I'm afraid that we're limited to simply 2 questions this evening. So we're going to have to close the debate a little bit earlier. This gentleman back there, yes.
First of all, I'd like to thank you guys for coming.
Thank you.
We managed to keep it pretty civil given the circumstances. I did want to ask you a question of Bret and Shmuley. It's a 2-part question. The first is, do you think that the Israeli government should subsidize settlement activity in the West Bank? And the second is, do you think they should permit expansion of that activity in the West Bank, even if it's not subsidized?
Do you want me to answer that?
Well, I was going to say age before beauty, but I'm actually older than you, so that doesn't work. Yes, please.
The answer is no. I don't think it should be subsidized. I'm from the Wall Street Journal. I just want to make something briefly clear, okay? I'm not a fan of settlements, all right? I just don't think they're the core of the problem. And I think that it is misleading from our debating colleagues on the other side to suggest they're the debating problem. Peter is right in many respects that settlements are very problematic in all kinds of ways, all right? Not least for Israeli democracy, not least for Israel's rule of law because of a lot of illegal settlements that are being put up here. There are all kinds of reasons not to like settlements, okay? All right? And as I said, I wish so much that they were the core of the conflict. I would be the first to advocate the dismantlement of every settlement if I had some reasonable assurance that what would emerge from the dismantling of those settlements would be peace, not war. But I fear that the opposite would happen. The opposite would happen, and we would have in the West Bank precisely the situation we have now in Gaza, which is hell not only for Israel, for the people of Sderot, but ultimately also hell for the people of Gaza. Because if the West Bank ends up as another Gaza, we are going to have endless war, and the people who will be suffering the most will be Palestinian people. If you allow a Palestinian state on the West Bank tomorrow that will look much like a Palestinian state does today in Gaza, it is a recipe for endless war and suffering and misery. All right?
By the way, can I just add to that when Peter speaks about, okay, so this is the question of Israel having a presence in the West Bank. When Peter says that even the Arab Israelis within the Green Line are discriminated against, I mean, I find some of these statements astonishing. Is everyone here aware of the fact that Moshe Katsav, the Israeli president, who was sentenced to jail for sexual harassment, the judge who presided over the trial of the president of Israel was an Arab. Are you aware of that? I mean, just to these statements of discrimination without any basis in fact are astonishing.
All right, the next question is to be directed to this side of the table. May I see only hands that have a question for this side of the table? All right, that side, in the red sweater. I don't see one. Wait a moment. Good question. I don't see one with a question for this side of the table. Yes.
Too close.
Beinart, both of you refer to the lack of citizenship rights, voting rights, all these, really demeaning things, and to the Palestinian residents of the West Bank. The whole point, they're not getting voting rights and citizenship rights in Israel when they demand a state of their own, and they should, and that's the goal. You're so such a good advocate.
Excuse me, we're very short on time. Yes. We need a question.
Okay, so why do you use that? Their goal is a Palestinian state of their own when the conditions are right, when we can make peace one day, and
what's the question? They
will have citizenship rights in the state of Palestine.
Excuse me, we must have a question.
Why do you continue to use that as an argument when they demand their own state, and rightfully so? When they have peace, when they agree to a peace agreement, they will have their voting rights. Why do you insist that they have voting rights in the state of Israel?
All right, okay.
Right. This is my point. You cannot permanently hold people without a passport, without the right to vote for the government that controls their lives, and the right to live under the same legal system as their neighbors who are of a different religion or ethnic group. Israel either solves that problem by giving Palestinians a state of their own, which you and I both want, or Israel will ultimately have to give citizenship and voting rights to Palestinians in the West Bank in the state of Israel, which will mean the end of the Jewish state of Israel. And it is because of my fear of that I write much of what I do on this very subject. I just want to say one more thing. Shmuley said very eloquently that we should all utterly condemn the call for genocide and the murder of civilians. An eloquent statement. Shmuley, both you and Bret sat on the stage with Sheldon Adelson when he called for dropping a nuclear weapon in the desert of Iran. Have you publicly condemned that call for genocide and the murder of civilians? Please.
Right. Sorry, but I just have to answer that because this is wonderful. This is Peter filtering Mondo Weiss about a debate at which you weren't even present, okay? All right?
So he didn't say that.
So first of all, I don't speak for Sheldon.
The New York Times reported.
Hang on a second, all right? Your mendacious reporter from Open Zion, quote, reported it, okay, misreported what I was saying, misquoted me, all right? And I'm not even speaking for Sheldon Adelson, but Sheldon Adelson, okay, what he actually said is, I would drop a bomb in the desert, not hurting a soul. So you just said he's calling for genocide. Okay, I'm opposed to dropping nuclear weapons in deserts or anywhere else, but he didn't call for genocide. I'm for scorpion rights and snake rights and fauna rights, but don't mischaracterize what happened.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Let me.
I think thank you, guys. We won't be taking any more questions.
Thank you.
So
Just a moment.
Yeah, we did have a question asked to us.
He wants to answer the question.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. All right. Yeah, it's a statement come question, but it does actually demand some kind of a response, I think, which is that, look, in 1993, the PLO, which is the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinians, let's not forget, we've heard only about Hamas pretty much tonight, some shots at Abbas personally, some of which are fair and some of which are not fair. I mean, most of these square namings were done by local committees and things like that. But the thing is that in 1993, the PLO, and by the way, even Hamas recognizes that the PLO is the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinians. Even they don't dispute it, okay? So there's no question who Israel is dealing with in terms of peace and who represents the Palestinians diplomatically. There is no document. No Palestinian document, no international document, no document with Israel, nothing that says anything except the PLO is the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinians. In 1993, the PLO, no, this is an answer to a question, madam. Very good. I'm glad you caught up now. Okay, now moving right along with my answer, in 1993, the PLO recognized the State of Israel, and the State of Israel recognized the PLO as the legitimate interlocutor, as the legitimate representative of the Palestinians, but not the Palestinian state, or even the Palestinian right to a state. So for over 2 decades, 1/2 of the two-state solution has met their requirement of recognizing the state of the other side. Now, no one is saying this should be done unilaterally. Peter was absolutely right. What the Gaza disengagement, and by the way, Sharon, who did it, gave it its proper title, unilateral disengagement. And of course, Gaza is still occupied. The UN Security Council has designated it occupied. You've got an international body that is authorized to make these judgments, right? Legal and political fact, Gaza is occupied. So is the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. You say China is occupying Tibet. Guess what? The UN Security Council has never said so. Even when Taiwan, yes, no, it's very important because we have an international body that is authorized to decide those things as legal and political facts. Now, I might agree with that opinion, but that is not a legal and political fact. The ongoing occupation of Gaza is. So what I'm saying is that until we have a two-state solution, and as long as we continue to have this situation of occupation in its myriad forms, expressing itself differently in at least 5 different areas, in the Golan Heights, in East Jerusalem, in area A, B, and C of the West Bank, all are different, and then in Gaza what's that, a 5th or a 6th? In these different myriad forms, it doesn't matter. We're going to continue to have a conflict. There is only one way out, which is a two-state solution. Thank you.
Can I just add for 10 seconds? Hussein, with all due respect, the United Nations Security Council has yet to pass a single resolution condemning the greatest slaughter of innocent Arab life in our time in Syria. 150,000 dead Arabs. So to say they have any legitimacy on Arab life is absurd.
Russia is villainously vetoing that, and it is vetoing it pretty much on its own. And
so it just goes to show you that we can't trust these bodies to protect Arab life.
For that, well, we should never forgive them for that, but that is not the reason, because the Communist government of China was not occupying the UN seat of China when China conquered Tibet. So that's just not the case.
All right, I'm going to have to intercede right now. We're going to have the concluding remarks.
Yes. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I apologize for some of the hostility, some of the funny moments that we had tonight. Thank you all thank you so much for the panelists taking out some time to come here tonight. If you guys want to hear about more about Circa events or any of these events, please do sign up for events in our email listserv. If you want to talk to speakers, I think you won't have time to talk to speakers individually at the end. If anyone wants a copy of the video tonight, please let us know. You can email us or talk to me individually after the event. Thank you so much for coming out tonight, and we look forward to seeing you at other Circa events. Thank you.
And we are selling books.